Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Chicago Justice Podcast. I am your host, Tracy Siska. I'm also Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project. Off the top there was our guest today, Susan Lee, who's currently the Chief Strategy and Policy Officer at Chicago CRED, Anti-Violence Program, but former Chicago Deputy Mayor for Public Safety under the Lightfoot administration. A really interesting conversation about all of that coming up shortly here. If you're listening to the podcast for the first time, please subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, please smash the subscribe and like buttons. We'd really appreciate it. It really helps us out. Looking to get involved in our work with people, dozens of people from across the country are, go to cjpnation.org, fill out a form. We'll get back to you soon. And if you want to support our work financially, look at the Patreon link in the notes or in the YouTube in the description. We'd really appreciate it. Coming up as we get into season 3 here next week, coming up is Jonah Newman from Injustice Watch talking about the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. Then we have 33rd Ward Alderwoman Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez talking about building up a alternative response to 911 in Chicago for mental health and other crises that don't need officers to respond. Something like a cahoots response that Eugene, Oregon, we've covered it in the podcast before. You can find it on our YouTube channel or earlier in the podcast for sure. And then we have Inspector General for the City of Chicago, Deborah Witzberg, who's going to be talking about the Proud Boy cop in Chicago and the issues around whether or not he should be fired and why. It's not as simple as people think. It's simple about why he should be fired, but it's not necessarily about his connection necessarily to the Proud Boys. It's how he responded during the investigation. And after that, we have Jim Daly from the Chicago Reader. And we're going to be talking about elections for the district councils that came out of the Community Commission ordinance. That is also on the ballot this year for everyone in Chicago, besides just the mayor and city council. We're going to be talking about the district councils. So that is what's coming up in the following weeks. Today, we talked to Susan Lee. It's a really engaging conversation about violence prevention, the mayor's office, Chicago, all of that. And then I will be back with you after that conversation to wrap things up. Susan, thank you so much for jumping on the pod. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start. You did violence prevention work in LA. So can you give us, before coming to Chicago, can you give my audience a little bit of a background on your work in LA before coming to Chicago?
Sure. So in 2006, I was asked to come and do a assessment of City of LA's violence reduction strategy, mostly focused on gang violence. And the 9-month process of the research led to a report called The Call to Action, which was, in the end, it was adopted by the City of LA as its blueprint for a new way of approaching violence reduction that is not just law enforcement focused, but it is really focused on building a community violence intervention infrastructure in the communities that are most impacted by violence. And so we started with, I think, 9 zones, and I think it's grown over the years. That strategy has persisted over the last 15, 16 years. And during that time, we saw a significant drop in violence in LA, but really lots of innovations around training and professionalizing what we call in Chicago street outreach workers, what we call gang intervention in LA, really developing a 3-legged stool that allowed for independence and integrity for law enforcement and community violence intervention, but coordination through the mayor's office. And so I think that model has now been embraced by many cities. And so as a result, and I've worked in Oakland, I've done work in Baltimore and other places to make sure that each jurisdiction is developing a balanced, comprehensive violence reduction strategy that isn't just relying on arrest, that it is really looking at the conditions in the community and really addressing kind of some of the public health challenges that we saw really accentuated during COVID, but having kind of the same root issues that contribute to violence as well.
So what brought you from I'm assuming they approached you, but what brought you from LA to Chicago to kind of try? I guess what I'm assuming has happened, and you can correct me, is that they wanted you to replicate your work you'd done in LA to Chicago. Is that correct?
Well, so in LA, I was not inside City Hall, and so I was inside outside partner to the city and to LAPD. And I think people saw the innovation that was happening in LA, and a contingent of stakeholders from Chicago came to visit LA. That's where I met a lot of my current colleagues in Chicago, and through that process, I met Arnie, and he asked me to join Chicago CRED, really to come and jumpstart the coalition of funders who had decided that they were going to make a significant investment into community violence intervention. And so, yes, the thought was that were there elements of what happened in LA that could be done in Chicago? But every city is very unique and special in different ways, and so Chicago needed its own strategy. Not sort of not that integrates all the major principles and pillars of the work, but really tailored to Chicago's specific challenges and conditions.
What would you say now that you've been doing this for a while in Chicago? What are the main specific challenges that you see that are unique to Chicago that weren't found in LA necessarily?
Yeah, and there are many. And, in some ways, I came to Chicago, I started coming to Chicago in 2016, right when the violence spike happened after the death of Laquan McDonald. And, it struck me, multiple things struck me about Chicago. One is just the sheer volume of violence. So, Chicago is not the most violent city in terms of per capita homicide. There are cities like St. Louis or Detroit, but in sheer number of shootings and homicides that we see in Chicago on a day-to-day basis, it's just on its own level. You know what I mean? So last year we had 4,000 plus shootings, 800 plus homicides. That was more homicides and shootings than New York and LA combined last year. So, and compared to those two other large cities, Chicago's per capita homicide rate is, I think 5 times higher than New York, and I think 3 times higher than LA. And so I think the intensity of the violence really struck me, and sort of the generation after generation of that level of violence and the depth of trauma, therefore, in the communities most impacted by violence was just out of this world. And then what other thing that struck me was, despite having this very entrenched violence dynamic in Chicago, you didn't have kind of the coordination mechanisms that other cities had developed over the last 10, 15 years. And so, the violence reduction field has done a lot of research and has sort of now benchmark lots of best practices and research and so forth. And none of that was really in the water of violence reduction in Chicago. And so that also struck me as the third largest city, like, where was all this evidence and information and coordination that needed to happen? And then thirdly and lastly, I would say it's just the history of segregation, and the entrenched nature of racial inequity and structural racism within Chicago's sort of culture is we have that in most urban centers, but really Chicago, it is very stark, and that struck me as well.
Yeah, I think that's something that does not get the play that it needs to in the media and needs to get addressed. I mean, I always tell, I've had a history when I was living in Chicago over like the last 15 years before I moved to DC. When I had friends visit or family visit, I would say, okay, great, let's go downtown, let's go to the beach, let's go do things, go to Lincoln Park, Bucktown. Great. Now I'm going to take you on the outside the potted plants tour.
Yeah.
Right. And I've had visitors from other countries and stuff. And I'm like, there's another Chicago that you need to see.
Yeah.
right? And I would
And
drive a little bit on the west side, drive a little bit on the south side. It's like these are the conditions people are forced to live in this city. So when you hear violence, don't just automatically think, well, bad people. Think about these
yeah,
circumstances.
yeah, when I first started coming to Chicago in 2016, 2017, I had a work going on in Austin neighborhood. And,
Mm-hmm.
I was told there was not a single sit down restaurant in Austin at the time for a neighborhood of 100,000 people. And that there was not a supermarket that could be easily accessed by the community. And so, I mean, since then, some things have changed, but that is what we're talking about, which is, that we have a disinvestment legacy that has essentially devastated these communities, not last 3 years, not last 5 years, but over decades.
I 100% agree. I like in 2011, 12, Rahm closed those 50 schools. And it was just more of a trend that mayors have been doing forever in Chicago, which is slowly pulling money from these communities and disinvestment. That only leads to more violence and more crime, right? You're setting up the circumstances to breed that.
Yeah.
And
I mean, one of my heroes in this work, Father Greg Boyle in LA, has, a saying that he does, which is, it's not so much that people are engaging in violence because they are bad or, they want to have, money. It's really the absence of hope that really leads to the cycle of violence, because as long as you think that you're not going to have the opportunity to move forward in your life, then there's very little at stake in terms of engaging in violence and, continuing that cycle of trauma. And I just want to emphasize the issue of trauma. Chicago CRED
mhm.
serves now over 500, 600 participants who are some of the most, highest risk individuals in terms of engaging in violence or being victimized by violence. And, without exception, 100%, I guess, of the participants and even some of the staff have experienced the level of trauma that is unthinkable for some people in this country. And I think that day in and day out exposure to trauma, experience of trauma, and the inability to access support to address that trauma is devastating. And it is at the root of a lot of the cycle of violence we see.
Right. People have no idea. They're like, why do whoever they are that is doing this violence, why do they make such bad decisions? These young kids are making such bad decisions. And I give them two answers. One, my wife's a PhD economist. When she was in grad school at UIC, she did this thing where she would talk about financial planning and stuff with CPS kids and talking about compound interest and what it would build and how you could save for your retirement and stuff. And kids are like, compound interest? That's 20 years from now. I'm not going to be alive. The odds of
Yeah.
me being alive or not in jail are very slim. And then professors in my grad school, grad department at UIC in the crim department did all these things with kids, getting kids and cops together. And the kids are like, guys, we don't have hope. Especially young men of color were like, I'm going to be dead or in jail by 30. First of all, that is an incredible societal failure that they have those thoughts. That said, if you can't cure that, if you can't change that kind of mindset from taking root, how do you expect them to make better decisions? They don't think they have a future. They don't think society values them. Like, you just keep taking money from their communities. There's no jobs. The schools are crumbling or they're closing. All of that breeds this. And I just I can't understand how, like, political figures here aren't doing something as an emergency to address that. We know that exists now. We've got to do something so when all children in Chicago grow up, they don't have to have that mindset is not bred into them by their circumstances, or we're not going to get anywhere. I'm ranting a little bit, but it bothers me that it's absent from the discussion. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question before I keep ranting here because it bugs me. Okay. When you came, get your opinion on, for lack of a better word, the competency within the CPD. Not some of the members, but within the leadership. I know when people come from outside the city, and I've known this for years, they come and they meet the leadership and they try to talk to them or some reform, some academic comes and they're like, wow. Like, this department is so screwed up and so poorly managed. Like, wow, like we heard things and you see some of the scandals come on, but like I've been to 7 other departments and wow, they're just so much better run than what's going on in Chicago. I wanted to get your feelings coming from LA to Chicago, what your feelings about that.
It surprised me for a second largest police department in the country to be in the state it was. However, I have seen many departments who might arguably be in that similar space of not having evolved into the 21st century policing model like some of the other large city departments have done. And actually, it gave me a lot of pause. And I tell this to everybody is that, in making the decision to come to Chicago, the thing that made me pause and kind of say, should I really be doing this, was the state of CPD, because it is absolutely necessary to have a police department that is effective and is conducting constitutional policing. Let's not even say progressive policing, but constitutional policing, for that to be an important part of a violence reduction strategy at the city level. And it was not at all clear in 2016, 17, that that's kind of what was going to happen. And then we got the consent decree. And so then, it put us on a trajectory to be able to at least attempt to get there. Having said that, Chicago Police Department has had lots of leadership changes, and each of those leaders have contributed something that altogether, if they had all stayed together and become part of the department's culture, could have been, really helpful in putting CPD in the right place. So, for example, there used to be a time when CPD was really known for community policing, and that sort of went to the wayside. And then there was a time when, I know there's a lot of controversy about Gary McCarthy, but he did bring in CompStat, the data-driven approach to accountability and neighborhood policing, that, had it been really implemented consistently and sustainably, we would have been in a better spot. And Eddie Johnson, for all of his, scandals and whatnot, really did emphasize the establishment of SDSCs and the ATCs, which are kind of the technology-driven infusion of technology into smart policing and so forth. So all of those things individually, had they all come together in a consistent and sustainable way, I think the department would probably be in a better place. But it's as an organization, I think that it requires some fundamental reform that we hope that, the consent decree gets us there. But, I have I'm sure of the op-eds that I have written and so forth. And so, I have concerns about that trajectory.
Okay. I do want to get to the op-ed, but I got a couple of questions before that. Thinking of the best way to word this. How has politics of the city impacted violence reduction and the possibilities that could be found in that space?
That's a really big question, because there's the big politics, P politics, and small P politics. And I think this is the way I would say it, and this is not like in the last 2 years or 3 years, but it's really generational in Chicago, is there is not a sense of one Chicago. There's kind of the downtown and the business community and the north side. Then there's the west and the south side. And it really, people who live in those places and work in those spaces do not see each other as one Chicago. And unless we can get to this sense of one Chicago, that what happens on the west side does impact the downtown and does impact the north side. And I think that, ironically, because of the way violence has shifted to downtown and north side, that now we're seeing a little bit more of that. But I do think there is this sense of great divide, and the south and the west side has despite, like, day in and day out violence in those communities. I don't think that was top of mind for not only political leaders, but business leaders, civic leaders. And I think 2016 sort of brought the civic leadership more into it. And I think in the last year and a half, we've seen more business community leaders sort of echoing concerns and so forth. So I think that's one of the big dynamics of Chicago that has prevented us from having a coherent citywide strategy. The other thing, and I'm sure this is not going to be very popular, is we have 50 aldermen and a strong mayor. And I think the politics of City Hall at times prevent the ability to have kind of a big picture citywide strategy move forward, because each of those 50 aldermen who are elected to do this, which is, they're really concerned about their ward. And so at times it's very difficult to see and knit together a coalition of people who can see the value of a citywide approach. And that's not unique to Chicago, but Chicago is unique for having so many aldermen and such small wards.
Yeah, and that has been a huge issue. And I have looked at, I think, we're in the midst of this political cycle now. The midterms are over. We're going into city elections. We have a mayoral race that's going to be contentious. There will be some aldermanic ones that are also, but in the mayor's race, and you can see it on social media now, this some of the challengers just ripping the mayor relentlessly for any violence that happens downtown, in the Loop, North Side. One of those challengers in particular, and I'll say his name, Paul Valls, has been around for a long time. And I wish we would have seen that kind of pressure about a shooting on the west and south sides. Because to me, they think it's politically expedient. People will only care that there's violence in let's say it's in white communities, white rich communities, or at least middle class above communities. People will care about that, so that's what we can challenge on. And it's that kind of thing that Chicago is stuck in, right? There's a certain level of unfortunately, there's a certain number of shootings and a certain number of murders that will get reported out every weekend in the weekend count, but won't really be a political problem for anyone. As long as they're on the south and west sides, and there's no huge number in one shooting, we're fine with whatever is there, right? We're fine with that. One of the things the pandemic has brought us is that has spread some. And I hope the political will be driven to not only resolve it in the white rich areas, but throughout our city. But it's very hard, as you said, it's very hard to get politicians from the north side. They're like, yeah, please give the south and west side more money and take some from our community. And I know when Rahm Emanuel came in, he closed 3 police districts. And the aldermen were ripping him relentlessly for it, even though Daley had a consultant's report back in the early 90s saying you needed to do that to cut the management. And I talked to some of the aldermen, and they're like, oh, no, we told the mayor's office we were going to do that. We have to rip them, but they still have to close them because they need to be done. But I can't possibly go on television and say, close my police district.
Right.
And it's like, oh, my God, it's such theater. Okay. when you came to Chicago, what did you envision as being achievable for Chicago in, say, the first like 5 years from a violence reduction possibility?
There was probably three things that I wanted to get done, and some of it has been done and some of it has not been done. First and foremost, I wanted to create and strengthen a violence intervention, community-based violence intervention infrastructure. And we have largely to the really the courage of the philanthropic community who invested enormous capital and not just funding, but social capital and whatnot to sort of fund the first basis of that, which is in the form of communities partnering for peace and Ready Chicago. And obviously, Chicago CRED also contributed to that by not only providing funding, but also having our own services out there. And so that was the most important thing to do because, without that infrastructure, you don't have a way in which you're actually intervening in the conflicts that can lead to violence in a real-time way. And so we needed to establish that kind of first responder who are community people who are credible and have traction with the people in the community and those who are in the thick of violence to be able to intervene and sort of interrupt that cycle of violence. So that was one of the most important things that I thought Chicago needed, and I worked with many partners to make that happen. In addition to the funders, obviously now we have a network of, I think, 25 organizations in 25 communities or something like that, that is doing this work. But most importantly, they're doing it in a way that is networked and collaborative with each other. So they're not just doing their own thing. They're all kind of trying to impact the level of violence in the same way and more data driven. So that was one important thing. The second thing is I wanted to see if we could create a public sector funding stream that would make this a sustainable thing, because private funders could only go so far. And it was really the mandate of the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities, which is the coalition of 50 plus funders, to demonstrate that there is proof of concept here, that this can work, and then shift it to public sector. And so when the opportunity came to help establish that public funding stream by joining Mayor Lightfoot's administration, I sort of did it because I said, that's kind of the next thing that we really need is a public sector stream. And lo and behold, we did have CARES dollars from COVID as well as ARPA dollars that came forward. And so now we have a pretty robust public sector funding, not just from the city, but also from the county and the state. And with President Biden, we've had a sort of resounding backing of the idea that public dollars should go to community violence intervention. And so that's been a really game changer in many ways. And then the third thing that I really wanted to see was this idea of one Chicago, that we needed a level of understanding about violence reduction that would help police become more effective and community violence intervention to be more professionalized, and that City Hall could be a partner to both of those entities to implement a citywide strategy. And so, we wrote the plan when I was at City Hall as deputy mayor. And that element of CPD effectiveness, reform, and is there a citywide strategy or not? I think that's kind of the outstanding question at this point.
Okay, so we're going to turn now. I got about 4 or 5 more questions, but we're going to turn it to your op-ed.
Okay.
If you don't mind. So you have a phrase in there, and it's all over the news, and you can't help but hear it, which is, not that you said it, but you're quoting others. We should just let the police be the police. What does that mean to you? How do you interpret when people say that, what they're meaning by that?
To me, it suggests that there are some who are saying that reform is not important and that war police to return to the way that they were policing especially the West and the South Side communities, that we would somehow magically have less violence. That is truly a regressive thought. Without an effective police force that is doing constitutional policing, we cannot hope to get out of this violence conundrum that Chicago is in. And so it greatly concerns me that there are not just political leaders, but also business leaders saying that, which then to me shows that we need more education and enlightenment about what a truly effective violence reduction strategy looks like.
You know, there was a book that said "The Way We Never Were," which is, conservatives to some extent, but a lot of people kind of harken back to a time that was better than the time we were in. But it isn't really better. You just thought it was better.
It was better for some, but it was terrible for lots of people. I mean,
right. For the vast majorities, it wasn't. Like back to the 50s. Well, I think all the women in this country would have something to say about going back to that. I know my PhD economist wife who works 40 hours and is kicking butt in her career and not a mother would have something to say about that. So when I hear that, that's it. It's to me like they're saying, well, wait, was Chicago better 4 years ago? Or was the policing better 8 years ago? I don't understand. What exact time do you want to go back to? Can you point me to a time when it was great? I also think one of our problems our society has and our city has specifically, we very much so overestimate the impact police have on violence and crime going up or down. The mere fact that crime goes up means the cops did bad. And the mere fact that crime went down, for numbers went down, they're the greatest. When in reality, they may, until you ferret it out and do all the research, they may have had less of an impact. They may have done actually a really good job and violence still went up. Right? They could have had some successful initiatives. It's much more complicated. People don't like nuance. So when my skin crawls when I hear we should let the police be the police. And I also think it's bad for the police. Like, I think we're not taking into consideration when people say that the actual safety and life and job, conditions on the job for those officers, you're just throwing into the grinder.
Yeah, and I think we as a society ask too much of the police. I think that they're asked to be mental health workers and social workers, and and they have to respond to all kinds of issues that probably doesn't require a person with a gun to respond. You know what I mean? And probably is counterproductive in some of those situations. And I think that's what the post George Floyd era has forced us to confront is how can we have an alternative response to types of challenges and issues and conflicts that happen in the community that isn't the police only, and I think, some of the jurisdictions are exploring that, and Chicago is as well. And so, you can only hope that those efforts will, prove to be successful.
I had a friend who was a watch commander that moved off and has since retired, but he used to tell his officers when they came to his district or new officers, I'd say, listen, guys, we are the social service first responders, right? We should be the responsive last resort because all we have is cuffs, guns, a baton, right? And arrest. That's all we have. But in Chicago, we're always the first response. Kid won't go to school. There's an argument. Anything, the garbage is getting picked up. It's always the police they call because if they call 911 enough, a cop has to show up. Where a city official or Streets and Sands doesn't. And that's doing a disservice to the men and women we have in the job, but no one wants to talk about that.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about this consent decree in the context of, for ladies and gentlemen on the pod, just recently the superintendent fired Bob Boyk, who was former executive director of the Office of Constitutional Policing and Reform. And he was a guest on this podcast with a couple of researchers from the University of Chicago, I think back in late 2020. Stage one, you talk about stage one, which is writing new policies. They have about 72% compliance with that. So that doesn't seem too bad. But here's the big one, ladies and gentlemen, retraining officers on to do their jobs in compliance with those new policies. 14.5%. What are your thoughts about how good or bad that is? And can we really move forward in constitutional policing if we have the executive director of the police, the office that's supposed to be doing this, fired? And I know Superintendent Brown at one point talked about bringing officers back from retirement, like volunteer officers, which blew me away. Like, I don't know if that's the worst idea, but I think I'd want a structure in place of people that are being paid to run that. I don't know. So I just wanted to get your feelings on that. I thought those numbers were pretty astounding.
The Chicago consent decree is structured in a way that the policies that get done first, then you do the training and operationalization, and then you kind of lead to culture change and audit and accountability. So it's not surprising that we have more compliance on policy because it was designed, those deadlines were designed to go first. Having said that, knowing that training, operationalization, and culture change is really at the heart of the consent decree, you would assume that a leadership that is committed to reform would plan for the adequate implementation of training and operationalization. And that's the piece that is really bothersome about the firing of Bob Boyk. It isn't so much that Bob Boyk is the guy who's going to make it happen. I mean, he's a great guy and he has done some phenomenal work, but it's the reason why he was fired. He raised a legitimate question about number of trainers needed to fulfill a consent decree obligation. And for simply raising that issue and asking the leadership to reconsider the decision to gut the training division of people, he was fired. So it's not even so much that he was the head of executive director of the Constitutional Policing and Reform Office, which is in and of itself, as you point out, important, but it was the reason why he was fired, which suggests that there may not be proactive thinking and structuring going on how to train and operationalize the consent decree, ultimately leading to the culture change that we all recognize is what CPD needs in order to earn the trust of the community, because that's really the ultimate goal, right? CPD needs to earn the trust of the community back, or I don't know if it ever had it, but like that's the only way you're going to get an effective police force.
Right, and it all comes down, well, a couple things. I've had friends on the job, and one of my friends said to me, he was on some task force with federal agents at one point, the FBI, and he was talking to them, and he's like, they get hands-on training on use of force every year, right? And he said to me, he goes, one of our problems is no one wants to put their hands on anyone, so everyone just tases people. He goes, but the FBI, they get training hand-to-hand every year. Like, they get that refresher every year. And at this point, he was about 14, 15 years on the job. And he's like, Tracy, I haven't been trained on anything. I haven't been back to the academy in 15 years.
Yeah.
It's like, how is that? I mean, it is possible. It's a money thing. It's a lack of desire.
No. Every police department that I know of has annual training requirements. CPD went for decades without one, and the consent decree mandated this training requirement, which is why it is a key element of the culture change that police officers need to refresh and be updated. So, for example, search warrants. This is a very complicated field of policing, and the law is always shifting around that. If you don't get updated training on search warrants and Fourth Amendment on an annual basis at the very least, I don't know how you keep up with the way to do it constitutionally.
Yeah, I don't either. I've talked to officers, and not like, the small number that I've talked to means all of them, but there is definitely concern within the rank and file at the patrol level of being undertrained and being also they haven't, and I found this for years, with the merit promotion thing, I officers have a lot of some officers have a serious doubt in their bosses and whether or not they're equipped to be mentors and to teach them, which is bad if you're trying to, move a department forward. I've always thought the lack of supervision has been an issue, and also like a strong management. I don't think the management, like oversight, Sergeant, great, you have 10 officers. At one point in CPD, they had to see them twice a shift. So that if they drove by an officer, even if it was just on the street and they both drove in opposite directions, they would log it in their book, and that was a little checkbox for being supervising your officers. So there's a lot of those problems. All right, we are back. Once again, I'd like to thank Susan Lee for taking the time to sit down with us. We really appreciate it. It's a really interesting work. I just want to caution everyone, there's a little bit of, I don't know, propaganda marketing going on. The people that do the anti-violence work, like Chicago CRED, Communities Partnering for Peace, or CP4P, they do amazing work, and their efforts should not be undervalued whatsoever. However, when you have political whores, people that will sell you anything just to get power, say anything and sell you anything and lie and manipulate to get you power, be careful. Part of that is we're doing all this anti-violence work. We're funding this anti-violence work. Ladies and gentlemen, these communities, we need that anti-violence work funded. It is not the Holy Grail. These communities are not going to turn around just because Chicago goes from 700 murders to 400 murders, which would be a massive decrease right now, right? Or to 300 or to 200. The poverty is not changing in these communities. Oh, well, if you just reduce violence, then you'll have economic growth and you'll have investment in these communities. No, what you'll have is gentrification. That's already happening. And that'll probably just speed up. The circumstances for these people will improve because violence went down, and that's great. Are the economic changes going to be coming? No. Is poverty going to change? No. No. That's a simple thing. Long-term, meaningful long-term changes in these communities have to, at the same time, address violence, but they really, really, probably more importantly, have to address, in my opinion, the poverty, the intergenerational transmission of poverty that is going on in these communities and has been for decades. And people are doing very, very little to change it. Daley did almost nothing. Rom did slightly more. And Lightfoot is doing slightly more maybe than Rom. And all of it is crapola. All of it will always fail. We have $1 billion TIF fund in Chicago that pays for parks and white communities and pays for that arena over by McCormick Place and pays for all these things, and it's helping pay for the redevelopment of the Lincoln Yards. Ladies and gentlemen, the communities are not going to change as TIF dollars keep getting sucked out of the general fund that could be spent on redeveloping these communities from the ground up with the people there. Instead, it's going to pay for all kinds of projects that are off the books. Nothing's going to change. I'm not trying to downplay the value of the work of the anti-violence people, but I'm just telling you that when you hear some of the anti-violence work, not seriously, but when you hear some of them market themselves, and then the politicians latch onto it, like that's the Holy Grail, that's the work, that's what, and for the politicians, they hear is like, this is what I've got to do to get reelected. That ain't it. Things are not going to change. They're going to get better in that violence has gone down, and that's great, and we need to do that. But the economics of those communities aren't going to change. It's just the bottom line. We need to change the economics in these communities. And it's very easy. Lightfoot with a pen could take most, if not all, the TIF money every year, over $1 billion now that is collected and put in off-book accounts that are not in the general revenue and don't go right to the schools or the parks. She could, with a stroke of a pen, pretty much take just about every dollar out of the TIF funds, market it as, categorize it as excess funds, and take it and do whatever she wants with it. The fact that she's not means that she is just worried about continuing to get reelected, keeping white developers and white North Siders happy. White North Siders now the near South Side, West Side, right? The South Loop, West Loop, Fulton Market, Little Italy, a little bit to the extent, right? That's who she's worried about keeping happy. And until that changes, nothing is going to change in Chicago. We have an endemic problem with violence. We have an endemic problem with the intergenerational transmission of poverty, and we won't do anything about it. They're only attacking the violence on the margins. The true anti-violence work, the true cures to the violence, a lot of the street violence, ladies and gentlemen, not necessarily in the homes, but in the streets, is reducing poverty, elimination of poverty, but no one's talking about it. And really, there are very few people in the city council that you're hearing speak about it, right? My guest next week is one of them. 33rd Alderwoman Rosanna Rodriguez Sanchez is one of those people. But have you heard it in the campaign trail in the mayor? Oh, I've got this plan, I've got that plan. Plan, sign a piece of paper, take all the money, give it to those communities. That's the plan. The plan always seems to wiggle out and make sure, or just slightly increase what the person before them did, just slightly, so they can keep sending it to white communities, right? Got to make sure Google's happy. Got to make sure Fulton Market's happy. Got to make sure the West Loopers and the South Loopers and Lincoln Parkers are all happy. Till that changes, nothing's really going to change. It's sad, but true. Okay. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Next week, once again, we're going to have a conversation with 33rd Alderman Rodriguez Sanchez. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Next week is Jonah Newman. My apologies. Next week is Jonah Newman from Injustice Watch. It's an amazing, amazing reporting we're talking about related to the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center and solitary confinement. Really great, engaging conversation. Sad as can be because the institution is so broken. And then we got Alderwoman Rodriguez Sanchez. After that, if you got ideas for topics you want discussed and people you want interviewed on the podcast, please let us know. Hit us up on our social media, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. You can write comments and we'll definitely take suggestions. We are definitely open to topics and people you want interviewed. Once again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be back with you next week.